Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, you guys sent in a ton of stuff on digital censorship in the U.S., and it looks like there's a lot to unpack here.
Oh, yeah. It's quite a journey.
We've got pieces covering everything from the Obama years and Trump's presidency to the Wild West of the internet during the pandemic. So
Right.
I guess the mission here is to figure out how the heck all this stuff has shaped what we can and cannot say online today.
It's kind of mind-blowing how the internet went from this, free speech utopia
Yeah.
to, well, whatever this is.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's rewind back to the Obama era. I mean, it seems like a lifetime ago now, but remember all the buzz around the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act back in 2016?
Oh, yeah.
At first glance, it seemed pretty straightforward. Like, hey, let's stop foreign countries from messing with our elections.
Right.
But it also kind of opened a can of worms.
It definitely did. I mean, on the surface, it's like, okay, combating foreign misinformation sounds good. But then you start to think about it, and it's like, hold on, who gets to decide what disinformation even is?
Totally.
And what happens when the government starts getting involved in those decisions? It's the slippery slope for sure.
It feels like that was kind of a turning point where we started to realize that the internet wasn't this completely free and open space we thought it was.
Absolutely. And speaking of, control and unintended consequences, remember the net neutrality debates? I mean, the whole point was to keep internet providers from having too much power over what we see online.
Yeah.
But some folks argued that it could actually give the government more leverage to influence online content.
It's like trying to solve one problem just creates another one.
Right. It's like, okay, we're trying to prevent this form of control,
Yeah.
but are we just opening the door for a different kind of control? It really makes you wonder.
And then, of course, everything got completely flipped on its head when Trump took office and basically turned fake news into his personal catchphrase.
Oh, man, the Trump era.
He spent his whole presidency bashing media outlets, calling everything fake, and that just poured gasoline on this whole debate about censorship.
Yeah, Trump's presidency was, without a doubt, a major turning point.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't actually create any, official censorship laws or anything.
Right.
But his constant attacks on the media really put the heat on social media companies.
Yeah.
They were suddenly under immense pressure to crack down on anything that could be considered, misinformation or hate speech.
It's like they were caught in the middle of this
Totally.
huge battle over what was acceptable to say online.
Yeah, they were trying to walk this tightrope between, protecting free speech
Right.
and, preventing the spread of harmful content. And let's be honest, they didn't always get it right.
And we saw that with some pretty major bands during that time, like Alex Jones and InfoWars getting booted off basically every platform. I mean, they were pushing all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories.
They were.
But those bans really highlighted the sheer power that these tech companies have over online conversations.
It was a wake-up call for sure. It showed us that they had the power to decide who gets a platform and who doesn't.
Yeah.
And that raised a ton of questions about, transparency, accountability, and whether they were being fair and impartial or whether they were pushing a certain agenda.
And then, of course, you had Trump trying to go after Section 230.
Oh, yeah, that was a whole other saga.
Which, for anyone who doesn't know, is the law that basically protects online platforms from being sued for things their users post.
Right.
But Trump argued that they were censoring conservative voices and wanted to make them liable for the content on their sites.
Yeah, that whole thing, even though it didn't really go anywhere in the end, really reflects the growing distrust that people have in these tech giants.
Yeah.
Are they just neutral platforms like they claim to be, or are they secretly pulling the strings and controlling what we see and hear online?
It's a question we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely.
And as we move into the COVID era, things get even more complicated.
Oh, yeah, buckle up.
Because the pandemic really threw everything into overdrive.
It's crazy to think how much the internet has changed. Back in the day, it was all about blogs and forums, and it felt like a much more open space.
Yeah, totally.
But now it feels like these massive tech companies are the ones calling the shots.
It's almost like we've handed over the keys to our digital lives to these corporations. And they're making decisions about what we can say and see without us really having a say in it.
Yeah, and it's not always clear what their motives are.
Exactly. And that brings us to the whole issue of, what tactics these platforms are using to actually control content.
Right. We talk about those outright bans, like with Alex Jones.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other ways they can limit what we see, like shadow banning.
Oh, yeah, shadow banning. That's a tricky one.
Can you explain how that works for folks who might not be familiar with it? Sure. So basically, shadow banning is when a platform limits the reach of a user's content without them even knowing it.
Oh, wow, that's sneaky.
Yeah, it's kind of like their posts and comments are still there, but they're basically invisible to everyone else.
So they're like shouting into the void.
Pretty much.
But isn't that a bit, I don't know, undemocratic? Like, shouldn't users at least be aware that they're being silenced?
That's one of the big criticisms of shadow banning.
Yeah.
It lacks transparency.
Yeah.
How do you even know if you're being shadow banned? And more importantly, why? What did you do?
It feels like a very slippery slope.
It is.
Because who gets to decide what content gets shadow banned? And what's to stop them from using it to silence people they just don't agree with?
Right. And there's always the potential for abuse.
Yeah.
But to be fair to the platforms, they argue that it's a necessary tool.
Wow.
They say it helps them fight things like spam and harassment and misinformation without having to resort to, full-on censorship.
I guess I could see that, but it still feels like a pretty extreme measure.
It is, and there's a lot of debate about whether it's really the best approach.
Are there any other options, like things platforms could do that wouldn't be so controversial?
Yeah, they're definitely experimenting with other approaches.
Like what?
Well, things like fact-checking and labeling content,
Okay,
or
yeah.
tweaking their algorithms to promote more trustworthy sources and limit the spread of, potentially harmful stuff.
Speaking of fact-checking, that seems like a pretty straightforward way to deal with misinformation.
Yeah, it's a good tool.
But even that has its own set of issues, right? Like, who gets to decide what's true and what's false?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Exactly. Fact-checking is super important, but it's not a perfect solution.
Mm-hmm.
You have to think about things like, who are these fact-checkers and what are their biases? Are they being fair and objective?
And how do you even fact-check an opinion? It's like, what's a fact and what's just someone's perspective?
Exactly. There's a lot of gray area there.
So it seems like even when platforms try to do the right thing,
Mm-hmm.
they're still walking this tightrope between allowing free speech and protecting people from harm.
Yeah, that's the fundamental tension at the heart of this whole issue.
And it's not just about individual posts or users.
Right.
It's about how we, as a society, understand and engage with information online.
It shapes the entire digital landscape.
And then you have to factor in those algorithms that control what we see.
Oh, yeah, the algorithm.
They're supposed to personalize our online experience,
Mm-hmm.
which can be helpful sometimes, but it also means we can end up in these filter bubbles.
Right. Filter bubbles, echo chambers, whatever you want to call them.
Where we're only exposed to information that confirms our existing beliefs.
It's like we're all living in our own little worlds, and it makes it so much harder to have real conversations about things.
Especially about complicated or controversial issues.
Absolutely. If we're only hearing from people who agree with us, how can we ever learn or grow or challenge our own assumptions?
It's like the internet is actually making it harder to have open and honest dialogue.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
But is this just a problem for, online discourse, or does it spill over into the real world too?
Oh, it definitely spills over. The way we communicate online has a huge impact on how we interact offline.
In what way?
Well, think about it. If certain voices are being silenced or suppressed online, people might be less likely to speak up in the real world, too.
Oh, I see, like a chilling effect.
Exactly.
People might be afraid to express their opinions if they think they'll be punished for it.
Right. And that can have a really negative impact on free speech in general, both online and offline.
It's like the internet is casting a shadow over our ability to have open and honest conversations.
It's a real concern, and it's something we need to be very mindful of.
Especially for marginalized groups who often rely on the internet to share their experiences and organize for change.
Absolutely. If their voices are being suppressed online, it can have real consequences for their ability to participate in society and fight for their rights.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. It really underscores how important it is to protect free speech and ensure that everyone has a chance to be heard.
It's kind of disturbing to think that the internet, which was supposed to bring us all together and make it easier to communicate, might actually be making it harder to have those open and honest conversations.
Yeah, it's definitely a paradox.
Like, we have all this technology at our fingertips,
right.
but it feels like we're drifting further apart.
It's almost like the more connected we are, the more disconnected we become.
Exactly. So what do we do about it? Like, is there any way to fix this? Yeah. Can we have content moderation without sacrificing free speech?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's an easy answer.
It's a tough one.
It is, but I do think there are some things we can do.
Okay. I'm listening.
Well, first off, we need more transparency from these platforms.
Yeah, I think everyone can agree on that.
They need to be upfront about how they're making decisions about content,
Hmm.
what their policies are, how they enforce them,
Yeah,
and what users can do if they feel like they've been treated unfairly.
right, because right now it's like this big black box.
Exactly. And when people don't understand how things work, they start to get suspicious.
They do.
It breeds mistrust,
Mm.
and that's where the conspiracy theories start to flourish.
So transparency is key, but what about accountability?
That's the other big piece of the puzzle.
Because who's making sure that these platforms are actually using their power responsibly?
Right, and that's something we're still figuring out as a society.
Yeah.
There are folks who say we need more government regulation,
Yeah.
but others worry that too much government involvement could stifle innovation.
Right, or even be used to censor certain viewpoints.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
It is, but it feels like we need some kind of oversight
We do.
to make sure that these companies aren't just running wild.
Absolutely. And it's probably going to take a multi-pronged approach.
Like what?
Well, we need to keep having these conversations, keep
Yeah.
the public informed.
Right.
We also need independent audits of these platforms' practices,
Okay.
and maybe even new laws that are specifically designed to address the unique challenges of content moderation in the digital age.
It's like we need a whole new rule book for the internet.
Yeah, we need to update our thinking to reflect the realities of how we communicate and consume information now.
And those rules need to protect free speech,
Absolutely.
but also ensure that these platforms are being used in a way that benefits society as a whole.
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
So it's not just about what's happening in Washington or Silicon Valley.
Right.
It's about all of us being informed and engaged citizens.
Exactly. It's about demanding more from these platforms,
Yeah.
holding them accountable.
Yeah.
And it's about promoting media literacy, teaching people how to think critically about the information they see online.
Being smart consumers of information.
Exactly. We need to be more discerning.
And that brings us back to you, our listener.
Mm-hmm.
You sent us these sources because you're obviously interested in this topic.
You want to understand it.
And that's awesome. That's the first step.
It is.
But we can't stop there.
Right.
We have to turn that awareness into action.
We need to be engaged citizens.
Exactly. So as you're browsing online, scrolling through your feeds,
Mhm.
take a moment to think about what you're seeing.
Question it.
Yeah, question it.
Don't just accept everything at face value.
Seek out different perspectives, different opinions.
And most importantly, don't be afraid to speak up,
Yes, even if it's uncomfortable.
even if it's unpopular.
Because the future of free speech online depends on all of us.
It really does.
Well, folks, that was quite a journey.
It was.
We started with Obama's concerns about foreign propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
went through the whole fake news era with Trump,
Oh, yeah.
and ended up in the middle of a global pandemic where the internet became like the main source of information for a lot of people.
And a source of a lot of misinformation, too.
Exactly. We talked about the tactics platforms use to control content, the ethical dilemmas they face, and how all of this impacts our lives, both online and offline.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. But the main takeaway here is that this conversation about digital censorship is far from over.
It's an ongoing process, and we all have a part to play in shaping how it unfolds.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep talking about it.
Don't let the conversation die down.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into digital censorship in the U.S.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.